and welcome to our channel. We are JAE Learning, and we are a group of special educators devoted to bringing evidence-based solutions to the moderate to severe or extensive support needs student. Because we believe at JAE that every student deserves the best learning experience. My name is Ann Tevis-Proctor, and I am here with Jen and Dia Lambenicio, and we are both occupational therapists. And today we want to talk about myths regarding sensory integration. So let's get going. So the first myth.
Sensory integration doesn't work. So how true is that, Anne?
Well, it's true and false, right? So sensory integration was originally developed by Dr. Ayers for children with attention deficit, and hyperactivity. Mm-hmm. And it had several important components that I think people forget about. That it requires individualized treatment plans, that it requires active child participation, that you have to develop a therapeutic alliance with a child, and you have to have the just right challenge in play-based activities.
I was just wondering, because like we both work in the schools, right? So why is it always that thing that they say, like, let's say a student has sensory processing issues, and they would say, but you're working in a school-based setting, so sensory integration doesn't work. So what is the difference, like sensory integration versus like sensory-based interventions that we provide? Like which among the two or which between the two are we actually using?
Well, we're actually using sensory-based interventions, right, in the school system, because we don't always have active child participation, and they can be involved in developing the play-based activities. Oftentimes our students don't have the ability to perform ideation, which means to go from one activity to the next. So for example, I build a big tower and I'm going to knock it over with a car because a monster's coming and the monster's going to stomp, that sort of stuff. Our students don't have that ability. So what we are doing is applying sensory-based interventions to help them regulate their sensory system.
I'm thinking that there is a disconnect between how people understand like sensory integration at a clinic versus like sensory-based activities that we do in the school setting, right? So let's just say that we already have something set up for our students who are in the classroom, sensory-based activities done on a routine kind of like basis. Because there's a myth that says that once you perform sensory-based activities, that eventually whatever deficits that they have, they're just going to get used to it. So is that something that is true or partially true, or what?
No, I think what our students are looking for is self-regulation, right? Wouldn't you say so? Yes. So I think the sensory-based interventions that we're using are us trying to assist them to regulate their sensory system in the classroom environment. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Well, like specifically for my students, I know that like some of them, they do show behaviors, right? Behaviors. I'm going to quote unquote it because later on we're going to discuss a different myth, right? Like that's related to behaviors. Like they show behaviors, like things that we can see are termed behaviors. I know some of them are showing those behaviors. You're right. Like just to self-regulate, right? It's their way of saying that, oh, where I am right now is not conducive for my learning, or what I'm doing right now is not the right challenge. That's why I'm showing certain things to kind of like indicate that I'm dysregulated, right? Mm-hmm. So basically in my experience, every single behavior would give you an idea of, or every single behavior would give you an idea of how you're supposed to tackle, that sensory processing difficulty, right? So now we go to that behavior. Like there's a myth that, sensory is just behavior. Mm. I know this is a little bit of a controversy because I know in the school setting, we are working with other specialists, right? Like behavior specialists, BCBAs, mm-hmm. who are helping us out in kind of like tackling, the behavioral issues that we see in the classroom for our mm-hmm. students who we also see with sensory processing difficulties. Mm-hmm. So why is this like that statement said, it is a behavior? Why is it like a myth?
Well, first of all, it's a myth because the various areas of their brain that are processing that at information are either over responsive or under responsive. So they're not filtering, or they're getting too much information. And oftentimes what we see with the kids, they gain a behavior, maybe it's a response, right? A response to that sensory input that they're getting too much or not enough. And sometimes some of the behaviors that we see, like eloping or meltdowns or crying or covering their ears, are really in response to the sensory information that they're getting. And they're getting that fight or flight response, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So that's a neurological response. They can't control that at all. And with us, and not that I'm to say that I am totally neurotypical. I think we're all on the spectrum.
Yeah, at some, at some level, we have our little quirks.
Yeah, we do. We all have our own quirks, but for us, we can find the socially appropriate ways to get ourselves out of a situation that is dysregulating for us, or we can find a way to handle that sort of overstimulation or understimulation in our students, because they don't have the language and they struggle with cognitive processes. They don't have the ability to do that. So they develop these responses to the sensory information that they're getting it's called a behavior. That's how I see it.
Yeah. I mean, you actually mentioned the thing that I always explain, like, let's say with, to parent educators or even parents, that a lot of my students being in that level of cognition that is not giving them that capability to communicate what they're feeling, right? Like what they're feeling, what they're seeing, like how they're experiencing the environment, plus knowing what they need to kind of like go back to that regulation. I mean, my students in the mild to severe mild to severe classrooms, they don't have that language. They don't have like even determining their basic needs, right? Like, I'm hungry, I want to go to the bathroom. I mean, those things, I mean, they're sensory too, right? Like if you want to, communicate your basic needs, like there's some form of sensory processing going on in that aspect. But most of my students don't have it, like just communicating. Even if it's nonverbal communication, they have trouble like letting us know that there's something going on that I cannot control, right? And I need help with it. So it comes out as a behavior that is, well, they say, oh, it's just triggered by this thing, so you have to do this thing. And a lot of my students, it's not like that straightforward, right? Like if you say, oh, this is what they did, like they eloped, and they say maybe because of this particular situation, but then again, it's not really something that you could pinpoint right away, especially if you have students who are not able to let you know what's going on, right?
Well, also it could be a cumulative effect too, right? Because they've been sort of, on the fringe of tolerating the stimuli in the classroom, and then suddenly it's just too much and they've got to do something, right? And so that's when they may do something like elope or have a meltdown. The other part is that our prefrontal cortex helps us regulate that sort of, determine if something is really seriously a threat. And if we're having issues with our prefrontal cortex, we can't really discern when things are a threat or not a threat, right?
That's right.
So that's why we're seeing these responses that people are terming behaviors, I think.
So I think pretty much we've touched on like whether it's like just pure behavior, or if it's a response, or if it's a neurological process, right? So let's just say, we see those behaviors, and then we've determined like, oh, this particular student responds to this type of sensory-based activity. Is it always true that, let's just say jumping on the trampoline, worked for, a specific behavior that we observe? Do we just let this kid jump like for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 15 minutes at a time? Because I see that in my classes, right? Like, oh, this kid likes jumping, and then they prescribe, like a 40-minute jumping session, and then they say it doesn't work. Right? Like it's not helping my student. Like it's making them more, because they're saying like, okay, if jumping is what you said would help, then I'm gonna have this kid jump like 3 times a day for 40 minutes at a time. So is it just like that? The more, the better?
No, I mean, you have to watch your students and you have to know their signs, right? Because you can, even when you're giving an activity like jumping, which is really proprioceptive for somebody who is seeking proprioceptive input, there's also a tipping point.
Yeah.
It's too
a threshold, right? Yeah. A
yes, there's
threshold.
threshold, right?
Yeah. And I don't think that people realize that, like even for us, right? Like, let's just say you like a particular scent, but you cannot have that scent for the whole day, in such intensity, right? Like sometimes it makes me think that a lot of our students, they just kind of like getting that domino effect. Like if you're not really watchful or observant of the ways they respond to the sensory input, they're just gonna go from this response to another response.
Exactly.
That's showing dysregulation, right? And especially for our students who are not really communicating that it's too much, I don't want it anymore, or I need something else, right? So yeah, like we see another kind of like sensory dysregulation.
Well, and the other thing I see a lot of is the use of like sensory hallways or sensory rooms. And, you just put the kids in there and they're going to get all their sensory needs met. And it's not really looking at the difference between an avoider and a seeker.
Yeah.
And people are not purely avoiders or seekers. You may be a tactile seeker and a visual avoider, or you may be an auditory seeker and a tactile avoider, but they think that you give them all this stuff. You throw them in a sensory room and it's all going to be good, or you give them a bunch of stuff at their desk, like a bunch of fidgets, and it's all going to be fine, or you put up a bunch of sensory stuff up in a hallway, and and we're going to meet their sensory needs. And sometimes meeting the sensory needs is removing some of the sensory stimuli, right? Yes. It's about keeping the noise level down, or making sure the light levels are kept down using natural light or light blockers, or those types of things that people don't think about. Sometimes it's not always just applying something. Sometimes it's removing something.
And I think you've already touched on that myth that like a specific set of sensory activities would work for all kids or all individuals who have sensory issues, right? So I'm thinking that let's just say I'm a teacher, I have a class of 10, 12 students. You're lucky one school year that you have students who have similar sensory needs, right? And you do the same sensory based activities over and over routinely, right? And they're regulated. But then another school year comes and you get a new set of students, and then they have different needs. Whatever you did the previous school year probably won't work for students who are, I see a lot of that, now, like a mix of students in the classroom, those who seek, those who are aversive to certain things, right? Like they're mixed. That's why I'm thinking that maybe what you had before, like your recipe of things that work for that, population that had similar sensory needs, won't work for a set of students who have like different needs. I'm seeing more and more of that right now. That's why when I get like requests for ball chairs, I cannot be giving like ball chairs to like 12 students who have different needs, like some who are like more sensitive to like the proprioceptive vestibular input versus those who are actually seeking for for those types of input. So what about in your classrooms? And like, do you see anything that like people would say, oh, I'm gonna use all the chewy, like this type of chewy for all my students, right? Because I'm thinking that in the past they've experienced that it's worked for majority of their students.
Exactly. Or the brushing, which has no evidence base to support it, right? Yeah. But I just want to get every kid on a brushing program, right? And it's not appropriate for all students, and it doesn't really have any evidence base to support that, using that sensory modality. So and again, it's about knowing your students, right? Knowing where they're regulated and where they're dysregulated, and watching and observing and taking a lot of good data and finding those points where they're open and amenable to learning based on what you've been providing.
And I think like even OTs, like sometimes I'm guilty of that too. Like sometimes like I forget that the reason why I'm having to use like individual sensory profiles, right? Like I have to take a look at those things like based on data, right? Like how my students react to certain things. Like, so before I actually say, okay, I'm gonna provide you with like a set of 12 I don't know, chewies, right? I mean, I have to make sure that that particular activity or sensory-based activity matches with what my students need, right? So I think we've kind of like made that discussion about that myth that all sensory activities are beneficial or appropriate or applicable to all our students in the
Can
classroom.
we talk about one more thing?
Okay, go ahead.
Brought about chewies, right? Okay, or jewelry, right? So what about our students who take the chewy or the jewelry out and mouth things, right? What about those students?
Well, I have students who don't necessarily have that, need for oral sensory input just because it's a sensory processing issue, right? Some of my students, they do the same thing because their cognitive level, their play level is still at that oral sensory stage. And I think that's another thing that we keep forgetting, right? Like it's not just sensory that we are having to look at, right? Like their sensory needs, but also their cognitive level, their play level. And kind of like just zooming in on that one area doesn't actually provide for the, like for their needs, right? Like you're not really answering the need for like more, more play that involves, satisfying that area or that level of play, right? So I remember having this conversation with one of my speech therapists. Like she was like, remember how they would do like all the, like when they're doing their assessments, so they assess the play level and everything. And then the student is obviously in the oral sensory stage. And then we're trying to just drive at like, no, this student just needs a chewy, the student just needs this and that. But it's not just that. I mean, it could be like there could be some students who may have both, right? Like I have oral sensory needs like for that input, but I'm also in that play level. So I mean, it's sometimes difficult to kind of like just say, this is the only thing that this student needs because this is what I am seeing, right? Versus like, but this is where the student is at. So the way you address that need could differ, right? Or might be different from.
Yeah. And we forget the students who are in that stage need to use their mouths to explore things, to understand them. And so when we take that away from them, we limit their understanding of the environment. Now, I know it's kind of messy and gooey and stuff in school, but giving them a certain set of things that they can orally explore so they understand what they are, right, is going to work far better than just sticking a chewy in their mouth. Because the chewy, they understand. It's like, I know this thing. You give it to me all the time. I know what it feels like. I understand what it is, but I don't understand what that thing is over there. And so I want to know what it is, and I'm going to stick it in my mouth.
Yeah.
Right.
It's different when it's just a function of cognition or just one area, right? Cognition versus like sensory processing. I think that line, like, and it's most of our students are like in the moderate to severe population, right? Like it's hard to draw that line because I mean they come to us already having that the delay in cognition, the delay in communication, right? And then you assess them and people see what they are needing, like play, cognitive stimulation, right, as just a sensory processing difficulty. So I mean, I see that, especially with the younger kids, right? Like our like preschoolers, kindergartners, right? When they're like delayed in cognition and play level, that's when they just like the normal play, people forget that if they're at that level, the normal play is to put things in your mouth because that's the way I learn, right? Like that's the way I explore.
Exactly.
Okay. Another myth. Only people with ASD, or I think ADHD too, right? ASD, ADHD, ADD have sensory processing disorders.
Not true.
Mm-mm.
So 5 to 16% of typical school-age children have sensory processing disorders, and 60 to 90% of children with developmental disabilities have sensory processing disorders, which really makes sense when you think about our students who have motor delays, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have a motor delay, you may miss a stage where you're crawling
Mm-hmm.
and putting pressure through your hands and getting tactile input. Or if you have significant CP, you
Mm-hmm.
miss the ability to explore your environment. So you lose a lot of sensory motor learning.
Mm-hmm.
So it's true that 90% of those on the disorder, on this autism spectrum disorder, have sensory processing issues, but we forget about our kiddos with CP or intellectual disability who may have sensory processing disorders as well.
Well, I am thinking because I mean, take a look at a classroom that's just, with all students with just autism.
Mhm.
They have the ability to move around. I mean, you would see again, I will quote the behaviors, right? Like, because they're ambulatory, they can move, they are moving, they can be seen. And then versus our students with what I got, cerebral palsy, right, who are in the medically fragile programs, right? I mean, they have like the physical limitations. That's why I'm thinking that the behaviors are more observed in those who are moving or making sounds and using their hands and using their feet to go climb. And I mean, I'm thinking that that's why people think that, oh, these sensory behaviors are much more seen in or only in ADHD or ASD. But then you have a student who's never had anything in the mouth because, like, what, they're tube fed, or right, like they have medical issues and they never had the same experience like exploring through the mouth or even with the hands. Like a lot of our students in the medically fragile programs, they hardly have any opportunity to explore with their hands, but then provide something else and you will see like certain reactions on their faces, right? Like they cry, something is aversive. So, I mean, there is a certain level of sensitivity, right? Like if you've never really been exposed to a lot of things, right? Or you've never actually had them play with different materials, right? Or expose them to different environments. So, I mean, there's a whole area out there that's not explored in terms of like sensory processing difficulties outside of ASD, outside of ADHD, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's important for us OTs, right, to actually bring that to the table. Like when we're talking about, oh, it's not just because they're not holding things, right? It's also because their environment has to be more enriching, right? So for them to be able to experience this and then kind of like address the sensory processing issues that are not observed, like versus with a student who has ASD or ADHD.
Exactly. And they don't have the ability to move or get
Mhm.
away, like you said.
Yeah.
So it makes it even more complicated for them.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. Well, that's all of our sensory myths for the extensive support needs, moderate to severe
Mm-hmm.
population. If you like what you heard today, please put a comment below and we will try to answer. And please like and subscribe our channel and we'll get more information to you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening and watching. Bye.
Bye.